Hello, I hope this video finds you well. Today we're going to be talking about some intricate concepts that are going to take your bass design and probably sound design as a whole a little bit further. Now, I'm not necessarily sure if I would categorize this as like the fifth section of a comprehensive guide to Neurobass, but even still, I like that I can just kind of update this and leave it to the members to kind of, I don't know, continue this like a series as opposed to like episode 1. So what I want to talk about is actually elaboration on the latest video that I put out as of August 3rd of 2023, in case if anybody's watching back on this. But basically I'm talking about creating bipolar waveforms using bias distortion. So what that basically means for us is you can go and check out the other video too if you want to, but I'm going to give you a little bit more of a breakdown on how this actually works. So if we take a listen to this sound, you can see on the waveform here on the right that it's symmetrical. And so if we change the bias to one side, then you can see that it's the same shape, but we've pretty much completely moved the waveform over to one specific side of the like plus or negative phase or whatever. And essentially, some people might consider this to be rectification, but we can kind of make this, I guess, complete as a waveform by taking another distortion and sending it to the top form of the bias. So if I'm using a square on top and a saw wave on the bottom, it's going to look like this. Let's go ahead and make that a little bit bigger. Now, what's really cool and interesting about this is it gives us a lot of space to play with. So before I go on, I'm actually going to go into the master here and I'm going to play with the scaling of this. There we go. So hopefully that makes everything a little bit more clear when we're talking about how this looks. You can see that there's a saw right here and the bottom is a square, which I find to be relatively fascinating. So with this, there's a lot of things that we can do. The first thing that I want to set up is we're going to set this from lane 1 to go into lane 3. So now these are working in parallel, and now this will go to lane 1 and this will go into lane 2, and then let's put a limiter on the outside. So all of the same stuff applies when it comes into like making a neurobass out of this, right? Like we can detune these waveforms, we can process them in such a way that is going to, I guess, like, you know, create the movement and filtering and stuff, and we're going to get into that here in just a second. But really this opens up a lot of doors because it allows us to process each waveform individually, which when summed together, again, like the saw wave is going to be on one side of the waveform and then the square stuff will be on the other side of the waveform. So if I were to make this into a Res, then we can detune this and then we can detune this, which together is going to produce a relatively interesting movement pattern here. And of course, if we were to play with pitch on this, you can see that it's almost interesting because like the waveform is growing and shrinking and growing and shrinking in certain ways. And of course, part of that has to do with phase oscillation or just the pulsing aspect of it, but it really makes the waveform seem like it's alive, and this might perhaps be more of a visual spectacle than actual use case. Even still, we're going to get some pretty cool stuff. So something that I've been doing lately, again, thanks to Zane Wolf, is doing lots of crazy like delays and stuff. And what we can do with this is really just set a stagnant type of delay on here at a relatively short interval. So by kind of messing with this and sending this through some pieces of distortion, let's go ahead and solo this. We can start to get some really interesting stuff just by kind of stacking a metallic layer on here. So we can combine that with perhaps some flanger. Maybe we can distort this in sections or in stages, which is pretty interesting. And maybe we don't want a 100% mix. And then we can continue to kind of just like go along and do stuff like this. We can also add comb filtering. And then what we're going to do is pretty much the same thing, but on the opposite side, or maybe like process it with some different effects, just to kind of showcase how this is going to sound drastically different. So let's go ahead and run that through another delay. Again, really short. And and then we can send this into something kind of like maybe a phaser. Distort it again. And as you can see now, like our waveform is like totally screwed, but it's still interesting. It still sounds, you know, like something. Also, if we were to low pass this, we are still going to have some movement in the low end. So it's okay, because if we were to crank the volume through this, then, you know, we can still have somewhat of a usable bass. Now, the other thing behind this, though, is that right now this is in MIDI, and what I would recommend is bouncing this into audio at some point, or, you know, just doing resampling and stuff, because really this is going to turn out to be some kind of growly thing in the first place. But what is interesting with this is that we're really just trying to create movement, and don't be so meticulous with like, oh, we're putting stereo in the sub, or we're doing like crazy, you know what I mean, like things that you're quote unquote not supposed to do. At any point in time, you can always high pass this and just send a direct signal out. So we could just go like this and then go send this to the master. But that's kind of just like a, hey, just keep that in mind. I don't think that we're going to need that for this particular use case. So anyways, we have this, this thing, and we can keep adding to it. So maybe one thing that we can do just for fun is we can add a notch filter here, and we can do some randoms. So set this to, sure, it doesn't really matter, but kind of set this to smooth. And I'm not going to be so meticulous with how I normally craft these with, you know, the notes following and this and that. It's really just for a means of building a concept. So take it for what you will. And if you haven't caught up on the rest of the Neurobass series, I would actually say, hey, stop this video and go look at that first, because we're going to be kind of building on some of those concepts. But as you can see, these are kind of moving independent of each other. We can set it at a different pace. And now we're going to introduce some actual movement into this, which will be relatively interesting. We're already getting some like crazy sounds, and really what the goal of this is to try to just create a wall of sound. Now, something else that's really interesting that we can do, and this is actually somewhat important, is that if we just shift this phase or frequency just a little bit, less than 1, then you're going to notice how it's going to interact with the phase of this other waveform. It's almost like we're actually bringing some of the signal back, and I didn't find that out on purpose. That was through experimentation, and it's not necessary to do through every step of the way, but I do find it to be interesting that that's a phenomenon. So, and what I think it is just rotating phase as a whole. So once we do that, we can actually distort this again. And one thing I want you to pay attention to is the DC filter. Sometimes if you've got some crazy DC offset, using the DC filter at the end of the chain can be helpful. Whereas, interestingly, if you detune some waveforms or use a high pass filter and the DC filter is on, it might actually move the waveform off of the DC, which I think is relatively fascinating. I don't really understand why that works, but it's just a thing. So once we have this, we can do some other kind of filtering if we want to. Like, let's say we want to keep it relatively simple. We could maybe even grab 2 of these guys and set one to do this. And then we can also set another one to do this. But really, like, the significance behind what I'm already describing is that we're processing this chain in 2 different ways. This is literally the top of the waveform, this is literally the bottom of the waveform, but it opens up doors for us to process all of these and like just have a finer means of control of exactly how we want to shape these sounds. You add that on top of harmonics, you add that on top of frequency and stereo, and suddenly like it's almost like another dimension to doing sound design, if you will. As you can tell, we're already getting some crazy monstrous sounds. So maybe one thing that we could do is, oops, I didn't mean to do that, is go back to this delay here and kind of just pull back on the mix. There we go. So now imagine what would happen if we take, you know, a multipass filter over the entire signal and start to process this as we normally would with a Neurobass. And suddenly the kinds of possibilities that open up are Well, just really interesting, if you will, and I'll show you. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to move this over to the right. This is a reverb, and what this is a slice EQ that already has bands set up, or rather the entire shift, so I can just make a makeshift interesting like multi-resonant filter, if you will, kind of like so. And I'm going to boost this up just a little bit. And now from this position, we can start to process everything else, and it's entirely using these macros here. And if you don't know how to set this up, again, go back and watch a comprehensive guide to Neurobass, either 3 or 4. That'll give you all the clues you need to figure out what it is that I'm doing exactly. So we can move this over a bit, maybe reduce this. And as you can see, this is kind of doing its own thing. We can add some distortion to the low end to try to make it fatter. Let's go ahead and turn this on. Yeah, you can hear that now this is a really fat sub. And what we really want to be mindful of is just making sure that the tone is identifiable within this part. If it's not, then we need to kind of go back and retrace some steps. But for whatever reason, if this is too crazy, you can always use some dynamics on here and just kind of bring some of this back. A short attack. Turn the gain up a bit. Because this is a bass after all, right? So yeah, it's already sounding pretty cool. So now what we can do is add, I don't know, a nonlinear filter. This is just a typical practice. We can turn the resonance up on here, and you'll see that this is on saturated. So we can modify this to start doing some weird, crazy things. And because this is everything that's not our sub, when it gets into this, I might even go a little bit higher, but when it gets into all this other stuff, we can pretty much stereoize everything or process this in any way that we deem necessary. So for example, I can attach a phaser to this. We can map the stereo there, maybe turn this up, and maybe even adjust the cutoff to where only that's moving. So now this is going to stay within the realm of the cutoff. The depth doesn't really matter because it's only going to move along with this filter movement. Something else that we could do is we can perhaps send another delay through here. And now you can see that we're getting some more metallic sounds that we're sending through this. Then we can distort everything together. Maybe not so much, but just a little bit. If for whatever reason this becomes too muddy, then we can always notch it out. And you don't have to do this step. It's just a means of like listening to the sound and being critical about what it's doing and being able to modify. So now what we can do on this is really where the magic is these two bands. So going crazy with effects on these is generally the approach that you want to try to take. I'd say especially around 250 hertz is when the most vocal growly growls, crazy type sounds come into play. So the more that you can kind of get sick with this, no pun intended, the more that you're going to be like, oh yeah, this sounds awesome. So we could do something like a flanger here and reduce the feedback, pull the spread to this guy, and maybe we can play with the mix on this, maybe with this dude. And we can again add just a touch of overdrive to this and do some more notching, or maybe we can even do some kind of boost. You'll notice that I'm just using the regular filter on this. That's just because I'm just trying to like variate what it is that I'm doing. It doesn't really matter. I'm not being too meticulous with this. I'm just saying, all right, let's make a decision and then give it a try and see what happens. Likewise, we can grab a chorus on here and set this tap to 3 and start to adjust this. And again, just with doing this stuff, like try to do everything. I know that sounds crazy, but really we're trying to create some crazy movement with it and then use like the spatial effects with it, flanger and chorus and whatnot, to spread the signal out or to kind of smear it so it's not so resonant, because there's going to be a lot of resonances within this. Sounds pretty cool. So now what we can do is use a Haas effect on this band here, just for fun, to make it a little bit more stereo. And for whatever reason, if you want to control this, then you can actually take the mix of this and turn it down. So that way only when this turns on is it going to activate that. It should still be audible because it's on. It's just that the effects of this are not going to be mixed in. Let's go ahead and add a fat shader to the top end. I almost always do this because like just it's nice to distort the high end of this. It sounds really good usually, and I kind of just leave this on. We can also control this a bit with this because this is kind of like a bandpass, but it doesn't cut as much. It might just be like a bell curve. So let's play around with the pitch and see if anything cool comes out of this so far. Pretty cool. What happens if we pull this before the distortion? Yeah, maybe we can turn the speed up of this guy so that way all of these are moving a little bit faster. And again, this rack has been set up in previous previous Neurobass videos, but basically I have a note that's mapped to the speed of all of these, so that way when I play a higher pitch with the pitch wheel, it's going to move faster. See how wild that is? All right, let's go ahead and finish this up. What I'm going to do is grab another multipass, and I've got this rack here that is the kind of like OTT. I call it the final neuro chain. And what this does is it has some compression on the low and the high end. You can also see that we are shelving the side signal here with the yellow to kind of reduce any stereo information that's in the sub. So this is kind of like our correction. And then this is just bringing the high end up. And for whatever reason, if this is too much, seems okay. But if it's like crazy low sub, then you can always just reduce this here and then pull the attack down and the release down. It's not really necessary though, I don't feel. So with that, this pretty much just gives it a little bit more crunch on the high end. Super monstrous. The other thing that you can do too is like you can try to run this through a final distortion if you wanted to. It doesn't always sound good, but sometimes it does. So maybe if we reduce the drive a bit and just see what it sounds like. Or we can try placing this perhaps even before that final multipass. And there we have it. We've got a bunch of, interesting sounds that with very basic waveforms, we are kind of pulling through. So that's pretty much the general setup with how all this goes. In the next video, I'm going to be talking about a couple of options that we can use to expand on this idea. And then in the third video, I'm going to be talking about how we can do some more crazy stuff with this.